So, good evening or good morning, as the case may be. I'm Steve Morrison, and welcome to my presentation. Uh, as we have all heard, there's an unusually large gap between the degree of scientific consensus behind global warming and public acceptance of this scientific consensus. In this study, I examine how technical and scientific communication theorists attempt to explain the disconnect, and I look for points of commonality and contention that might highlight existing controversies in the field and hopefully point towards productive courses of future research. Though it's limited in topical scope, this study provides useful insight into the broader field of TC not only because it focuses on the increasingly necessary area of communication between scientific and lay communities, but because it deals with communication directed toward what is often an unreceptive or an oppositional audience. And so it directly addresses the contemporary movement of TC toward a more rhetorical, theoretical underpinning. You can see here the broad path the presentation will follow, moving counterclockwise from the title. First, I'll discuss what is and what is not a controversy in the field. Next, I'll explore in some depth the four overlapping causes to which the theorist I studied attribute the problem, and also in this section, I'll explore the major points of contention between theorists, and you'll see that in some cases the disagreements are profound and really even fundamental. Finally, I'll go over a few notable omissions and then examine a few possible implications and suggestions for the future before moving on to your questions and comments. So, one key point that must be emphasized here is that much of what is controversial about global warming in the general public, and in particular in political circles, is not at all controversial in technical communication. Indeed, there is no TC debate about the science. But more interestingly, there seems also to be no basic debate about why so many people don't believe the science. All the theorists, to some degree, place that blame on science communicators. Of course, they virtually all accept that there exists an active and rather effective messaging machine on the other side, but they all likewise suggest, either explicitly or implicitly, that improving science communication is the best way to solve this problem. What this implies, of course, is that the authors seem to accept that there can be no real measure of the quality of a document beyond how it works for the audience, which in turn suggests that calls for a more rhetorical foundation for TC, such as Rutter's History, Rhetoric, and Humanism, or at the very least calls to move away from positivism, as put forth by Carolyn Miller or Mary Lay, have become the norm. So, what is the controversy? Well, in its simplest form, the controversy is really the core question of TC, which is just what makes an effective document. What are the problems causing ineffective documents, and what are the best ways to solve the problems? Of course, as we'll see in the next section, the limited scope of this study produces a similarly limited set of answers to these questions. And, as we'll also see, not only is there disagreement about the causes of ineffective global warming communication, but these disagreements often mean that the solutions offered by one person align with the problems identified by another. In fact, the web of disagreements is quite complex, and providing some clarity of the existing conflicts will be a major goal of this presentation. The corpus of articles was selected by searching several databases for recent articles within the past 10 years or so, using the terms global warming or climate change and communication. I then supplemented this with slightly more general searches of TC-specific publications, JTWC, TCQ, etc., and then found articles that actually had the appropriate focus. By examining the keywords associated with the articles and by my own perspective of the content of the article, I was able to come up with four broad but quite overlapping topical categories. I'll discuss each of these in more detail, but I just want to emphasize again the overlapping nature of these categories. For example, several authors argued that ineffective framing of the issue undermined audience agency and so reduced civic participation. Others suggested that the epistemological foundation of science communication reduced agency or, in some cases, interfered with clarity. So while we'll look at the four categories individually, in many cases the conflicts I'll discuss will actually cross the categorical lines. We'll begin by looking at clarity, and I'll give you a moment to read these quotes, but let me suggest that you start by reading the three here on the left-hand side, and then moving to the Badescu quote at the top right. So, starting with the three on the left, I'd note that while there appears to be a broad agreement that discussions of probability interfere with the perceived clarity of a document, the cause of that interference is a matter of substantial debate. So, is it the use of numbers and terms, as Lakoff suggests? Is it the concept of probability itself, like Simpson suggests? Um, or is the opposition creating the problem, as Moore suggests? This is particularly important when one considers the implied solution. For example, the IPCC report, it avoided using numbers in an attempt to make its findings more accessible, which would seem to align with Lakoff and with popular TC lore. But the Badescu article notes how problematic this was. For example, the term very likely was supposed to correspond to a 90% probability, but in surveys, people actually assigned it a value of anywhere from 60 to 95%. So would numbers help or not? Or, as Simpson suggests, is it the concept of probability that confuses people? Spool then goes on to suggest that science communication must actually have the job of teaching science in order to be effective. It has to develop public expertise. But one wonders about the practicality of that, particularly when numbers are off limits, and as Moore suggests, there's a large and coordinated effort to undo all of your instruction. Happily, one issue, albeit a relatively small one, was largely without controversy. Uh, Both Marissa and Meller agree images have the potential to be problematic and should be used carefully. Next, we'll discuss framing, and again, I want to give you a little time to read, but just pay particular attention to these top two quotes and how they relate to each other. I know I'm probably not giving you enough time to read, but I'm going to go ahead and go on, and you can read while I talk. Um, Once more, there is a substantial direct conflict in this area. Excuse me. But in addition, we're going to see that there are many links between the ideas in this area and the ideas in the next two areas. So we're going to be revisiting this a lot as we go on. As you can see, one matter of debate is the use of apocalyptic narratives. Three sources here arguing that science communicators fail because in some way the narratives that they construct are not sufficiently apocalyptic. On the other hand, Faust and Murphy argue that the narratives are too extreme and they create a particular kind of unproductive, tragic apocalyptic narrative, which will have further implications in the agency section to come. Additionally, we can see that some of the focus, such as Lively and Lakoff, is on opposition framing. And while there isn't any apparent conflict here, their ideas will conflict with other theorists in the epistemology and the agency sections, respectively. So once again, we'll be returning to these ideas of Lively and Lakoff. Let's move on to the next section here. And once again, there's more to read, and so I'll give you more time. But I would ask that you note the substantial and really even the fundamental conflicts concerning the perceived epistemological foundations both of science communicators and of the anti-global warming communicators. So, as you can see, Lakoff and Meller here, both on the left, suggest that TC has not sufficiently embraced postmodernism. Simpson argues, on the other hand, down here, that the TC's positivist position is actually forced on it. So she accepts that it is positivist, but argues that it's basically a product of the opposition that has claimed postmodernism for itself. But then goes on to suggest that postmodernism is actually part of the problem in the first place. Banning argues that the opposition's postmodern stance is insincere. But unlike the others, he believes global warming communicators are actually stuck in postmodernism and they keep trying to engage in dialogue with the opposition. So he advocates a return to a more absolute view of truth, which is precisely the opposite of what the Sproul article suggests. And finally, Livesley, as already implied by the information in the framing suggestion, argues that the opposition has staked out the powerful and effective Enlightenment sense of facts and rationality and claimed it for its own. So the conflicts here are stark. Is the problem that technical communicators are too postmodern, or is it that they are insufficiently postmodern? Is it that the opposition has claimed postmodernism, or is it the opposition has claimed Enlightenment rationalism? There seems to be no clear resolution to these complete and absolute disagreements. Here is the final of the four subcategories, and while you're reading, please note that I've tried to indicate some of the key conflicts in brackets. First, I'll draw your attention to some of the conflicts with earlier suggestions from the previous sections. For example, Brule here in the upper left-hand corner argues that Lakoff's solution to the framing problem would actually undermine audience agency. And then Brule makes a proposal for more dialogue, but that in turn is undermined by Banning's view of the problem's epistemological roots. Similarly, Faust and Murphy's call to avoid certain words that indicate certainty, will, and must, and so forth, that conflicts at least to some degree with Moore's earlier suggestion in the clarity section that anti-global warming groups have created a false sense of uncertainty about the issue. So is excessive certainty the problem, or is excessive uncertainty the problem? Even within this single issue of just agency, however, there's still quite a bit of disagreement, with some people suggesting apocalyptic narratives promote agency, while others standing firmly against those narratives or arguing only for a particular kind of narrative down here. So in essence, it seems that the only real point of agreement in the agency section is that it is in fact necessary for communicators to promote civic engagement through supporting audience agency. That should be a primary goal. How that should be done and what prevents it currently, those are unsettled questions. As you can see, I've noted here three seemingly substantial omissions. First, I found it interesting that despite extensive examination of anti-global warming communication, there's almost no discussion of the ethics involved, except for a few pieces focusing on business ethics in general. That is, there seems to be no consideration that the anti-global warming pieces are written by technical communicators. Instead, the people behind the communication are essentially invisible, portrayed as corporations or as merely the opposition. So, given the extensive discussions we've had about the professionalization of the field, and given the fact that one element of professionalization is an ethical code, it seems strange that despite the widespread acknowledgement that the anti-global warming communication is in fact deliberately deceptive, there is no suggestion that any individual is behaving unethically. Additionally, as I say here, it's not clear that anyone has actually studied how many people who are skeptics actually view global warming communication. So the argument that the widespread disbelief in global warming science is an indicator that the communication is at fault may not be entirely accurate. And finally, given the extent of the disagreement, it surprises me that almost no one seems to be studying the effect of communication on an audience, via survey or observation or whatever. The one exception here being the Badescu piece. Last, I'd like to offer a few thoughts and questions on how to proceed, and I'll let you read those and respond as you will. But my closing point would simply be that while I think the rise of theory and the attempt to seek new and better theoretical foundations for the field is as admirable and necessary, I wonder if some practical grounding and application could provide needed assessment of theory, and maybe offer something akin to like the comparative effectiveness research that exists in medicine. Maybe here I'm asking the humanities to become a little too much like the sciences, but as we've already discussed quite a lot this semester, the proper place of TC seems very much an open question. My concern from this study is that this openness, while seems wonderful at promoting new ideas, may deny us the progress that the field, and in the case of global warming, the world needs so very much. Thank you, and we'll move on to questions and comments.